Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is Dynamics 365 Project Operations Data Migration. My name is Cora, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this session through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. This session is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. When you join this event, your name, email address, and/or phone number may be viewable by other session participants in the attendee list. By joining, you're agreeing to this experience. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions in chat during the presentation. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have a senior solution architect team, including Veselina, Eneva, Martin Walker, and Marc, who will be kicking things off today. Marc, over to you.
On the agenda today, we have as our first topic the Data Application Lifecycle Management, where we will be talking about different tools and when or where to use them. Next topic is regarding data migration for master or sometimes reference data called. And we will end with the topic of opening balances and transactions. Let's first have a look to the architecture. Project operations is a solution that has 3 deployment types. In the light or deal to pro forma invoicing deployment type, we are only using the Dataverse application, which also wraps the Project for Web engine for scheduling management. Notice that the Project for Web is writing asynchronously its data to the Dataverse. All changes to scheduling entities cannot be made directly on the Dataverse, but we will have to be done via Project for Web. In the stock or production-based deployment type, you are using only the Finance and Operations application. So we will be doing revenue recognition, invoice, expense, and so on the Finance and Operations, as well as project and also the work breakdown structure on those projects. Everything will be done in Finance and Operation. But finally, if we look into the resource non-stop deployment type, you see that we're using both the Dataverse and the Finance and Operations applications, and they are integrated via dual write. And that's the reason why we are sometimes also referring to the integrated deployment type. For this tech talk, we're going to focus on the resource non-stop scenario or the integrated one. Also, we would like to point out that we will not cover the cutover and go live preparation activity in this tech talk. Each component in the solution has its own tools and mechanism for data migration. Finance and Operation platform has the data migration framework. Dataverse has the configuration migration tool, data import. For the entities which are related to scheduling and that are projects, tasks, task dependency, resource assignment, project team members, and project bucket, we must use the project schedule API. So we cannot directly upload data into those entities, but need to go via the project schedule API. Let's first have a look to the Finance and Operation data management tool set. Basically, we can cover nearly all Finance and Operations data migration scenarios using data migration framework, or also called DIXF. Although there are other possibilities, for instance, the DMF is using data entities, and some of those data entities are also available for all data and can be used from a client such as the Excel add-in. But although we have those possibilities, especially for large data loads, typically we will be better off using the DMF, giving it scalability and parallelization capabilities. In the DMF, we can also copy from one legal entity to another And we do have a library of templates with dependencies for uploading data. Another tool that we are using in finance and operations is LCS. And with LCS, we have possibilities for directly copying the database from one environment to another, for doing backup, restore in an environment, for doing point-in-time restore. And typically, if we're going to do a refresh operation, we're going to copy either from production to sandbox, or we're going to promote a sandbox into our production at go live. And we have possibilities for copying a database from a tier 1 development station to sandbox as well. Dataverse has similar capabilities for backup, point-in-time restore, and there we're not going to use LCS, but we're using the Power Platform Admin Center. The last component in our data management tool set for finance and operations is the data sharing framework. I have marked the data sharing framework here in gray because this is a component that can be used in the stocked scenario. So if we're only working in finance and operation, then data sharing framework is a valid option to be used. But since the data sharing framework basically is copying the data from one legal entity to another without triggering the dual write, this framework is not suitable in the integrated scenario because our Dataverse environments would not get updated as we would get updates in finance and operations. I definitely would make a highlight that there is a TechTalk dedicated regarding data migration for finance and supply chain management, and I would refer to that TechTalk for more details about all those tools. So if we start an implementation, then typically we would start building a golden configuration. For project operations, the integrated scenario or golden configuration will basically have a finance and operations environment and a Dataverse component. We will typically use LCS for deploying those both environments. And then once they are deployed, we're going to set up a dual write connection between the golden config in finance and operations and the one in Dataverse. And basically, by setting up that dual write connection, we're going to start already sharing some entities. So definitely the companies that are set up for dual write, that information will already be synchronized from our finance and operations into our Dataverse environment. Next step in the configuration typically would be that we're going to start defining transaction categories. Those transaction categories typically will be defined in our Dataverse environment, but basically we will go automatically also getting a dual write synchronization to finance and operation. And in finance and operations, for each of those transaction categories, we're going to define a shared category. So basically, we will have 4 shared categories for each transaction category. So if you would have, for instance, transaction category travel, you will get travel hours, travel fee, travel item, travel expenses in as shared categories on finance and operation. And then from the shared categories, typically we're going to select which of those shared categories are used in a specific legal entity or company. And so we're going to define the project categories. Now, once we have set up those things in both environments, typically we will finalize our configuration by doing the remaining finance operations setup in the finance and operations environment and the remaining Dataverse setup in our Dataverse environment. Once we have defined our golden configuration, the typically actions that we're going to do is copying those golden configuration environments to the other environments, for instance, a sandbox environment for doing UAT, or as I mentioned already, once we're ready for go live, copying the golden configuration or the pre-prod environment directly into our production. But important here is that we need to do that on both environments. So the first thing that we need to do is making sure that we have those two environments in sync. And if we want to copy, we will need to stop activities in our golden configuration environment and making sure that there is no dual write activity running between the two environments. Next step that we're going to do is we're going to unlink our target pair. So if the UAT environments had already dual write set up, our first step is breaking that link. And then we're going to do a refresh operation. So we're going to copy over the golden configuration to the UAT environment, as well for the Dataverse as for our finance and operation. The third step that we're doing is, since we have been copying the databases, some of the dual write information as it consisted in the golden configuration will be duplicated into our target pair, and therefore we're going to do a cleanup activity. There is a link here in the presentation pointing you to the docs article, and that explains what you need to do for cleaning up those tables. After that cleanup has been happened, so we don't have any information left over from the golden configuration dual write setup, we're going to link the target pair again. We're going to activate the maps, and we're ready for start if it's a UAT for doing our UAT testing in the environment, or if it is production, we're ready to start production. So a couple of caveats that I want to highlight here. So first of all, since we only want to have managed solutions in our production environment, if you need to make changes into the golden configuration, you will need to use a development station, create a managed solution, and deploy that managed solution on the golden configuration. Another caveat for the finance and operations pairs then is if we want to refresh from golden config to UAT, we first must make sure that we have the code packages deployed, the same code package deployed in golden config as in our UAT, and then before we start refreshing the database. Okay, if we look a little bit to what we have on the Dataverse side, so the first tool that we were mentioning is the Data Import Wizard. Data Import Wizard basically is a tool that parses input files. Input file can be of different formats. We're supporting XML, Excel files, CSV, text files, zip files, and so on. And basically, it has a wizard, and that wizard is capable of matching the data that is coming in the file and matching it with the fields that are available on the entities that we're trying to upload. We can also do some lookup. So if there is a foreign key, an alternate key, then we can easily look up the data. But once we have the necessity of having more than one field, for instance, if we're going to take an example and we're looking for uploading accounts in the integrated scenario, in the integrated scenario, we need to select an account of type customer, and then the customer has a mandatory field customer group. And for finding the identifier for the customer group, we need to know not only the customer group ID, but also the company. So we need company and customer group ID for finding the customer group. And this is something that unfortunately we will not be able to do with this data import wizard. The data import wizard also have possibilities for finding duplicates, and typically is used when we are going to upload data, small batches of records, or really very isolated data. But as soon as we have a lot of references or we have a lot of records to be uploaded, then this tool will not suit that purpose any longer. Next one that I want to talk about is the configuration migration utility. So this tool is delivered in the Dynamics 365 SDK. We will use a source environment. From that source environment, we will be generating the schemas. Once we have the schema, we will be exporting source CRM using that schema, and it will generate a zip file, which contains as well the schema as the data. Then we will use that tool, which will be linked to our destination or target environment, and we will be uploading the exported files. This is typically something that is used, for instance, if you want to install demo data, you will see that you will get a package from us with which is using the configuration migration utility for uploading that demo data into your environment. But typically, if we're talking about large migration projects, then you will see that in most cases we will need more efficient tools, and the typical ones for that are been used that we see in the field being used is SQL Server integration services. And then typically you need a Dynamics 365 adapter. Some examples: Kingsway Soft, Cozy Rock, DevOps, OneTap. So it's all adapters that you can plug into your SSIS, and that you can use your data and upload it into your Dataverse environment. Another way of doing it is you could also use Azure Data Factory. Azure Data Factory has a lot of possibilities for getting connectors to different data sources, possibilities for doing all kinds of mappings, transformations, and so on, and also has a native connector to our Dataverse environments, so can also upload data directly to Dataverse. As last consideration regarding the tools, just wanted to highlight that in the field we also see the use of third-party commercial tools, such as TIBCO Cloud integration, or in the past called Scribe. Besides just using a commercial tool, we also see in the field that a lot of our partners actually are creating custom code for doing those uploads, and this links basically is linking to a sample program where we are demonstrating the use of the CRM service client and the task parallel libraries for maximizing the throughput in our migration. Of course, always we need to remember that when we are using tools which are using OData calls, we do have to take into considerations the service protection limits that exist. So this links will bring you into our docs page where we describe those limits. Also, I want to put here some attention. We do have a tech talk regarding data migration for Dataverse environments. It's dated from 2018, but still has some very, very useful information and guidance for moving forward. Last point as consideration is if we have entities that exist as well in finance and operations as on the Dataverse side, we should consider disabling dual write, because dual write will have a huge performance impact. So if we do bulk uploads, it might be that our data migration strategy becomes way too slow. And in that, for mitigation, the only possibility that we have is you can disable the dual write. And then once you have disabled the dual write and you have uploaded in one in the source environment, you could then use enable your dual write map again and use the initial sync for synchronizing the data. That initial sync basically will use the data migration framework on your finance and operation for getting the data from your source to your destination. Another possibility, and probably the possibility that you will consider if we're really talking about very large data sets, is that you can upload your data as well in the finance and operation as in the Dataverse entity, while your dual write is disabled. And then the moment that everything is uploaded in both systems, and you're absolutely sure that you have all the records as well in your Dataverse as in your finance and operation, we can just enable the dual write map, and we don't need to do initial sync any longer because we are already certain that we do have the data on both sides. Okay, let's move over to the next topic, which is basically our master reference data. For that, I'm going to show you a demo. Unfortunately, I cannot do the demo live because the time for this TechTalk doesn't allow it. So what we have been doing for the demo is we have been recording it up front. We're going to show you parts of the recording and explaining what we were doing while we were recording. So we were assuming that we received some Excel files from our customers. As a first step, we're going to upload them into our Azure Blob Storage. And then we're going to create an Azure Data connector from the Azure Blob Storage to an Azure SQL data migration environment, and basically uploading first all the data in tables into our Azure SQL. As a second step, you will be seeing that I'm going to download some information from our project operations. So project operations environment might have already some reference data. Think, for instance, the legal entities or the company data is already there, but also we might have already been having uploaded some finance and operations customer groups. Basically, we want to have that information available in our data migration. So I'm going to, as second step, to download some of the entities from project operations and make sure that I have them available in my data migration. And as a third step, I'm going then to match the data, the reference data that I have been downloading from project operations with the data that was uploaded from our customer for preparing a data set that can be uploaded to project operations. And in this demo, we're going also to use the Azure Data Factory for doing that. Okay, the first thing that I'm showing here in the Azure Data Factory is that we have 3 linked services. So we have a linked service to the Azure Blob Storage, we have a linked service to the Dataverse, and we have a linked service to the Azure SQL database. We created some data sets on those services, and then we created the first pipeline is basically the download. So this is for downloading the reference data that was already in my project operation. So as you can see, company is one of the entities that I'm downloading, customer group, and typically I have been writing some stored procedures for just making sure that I can easily do some lookups. Now that we have downloaded reference data, we're going to switch over to the second pipeline, and that's basically a pipeline that I defined for getting the data from the Excel files which were uploaded to the Azure Blob Storage, and also going to copy that into my SQL data migration environment so that I have that data there as tables. At this moment, I'm only copying the data, so I'm not doing any transformations or just making sure that I have in my data migration environment, I do have the data that I received from the customer. As you can see, in this example, we're asking for 5 customers to be uploaded. And if I look into my project operation environment, you see that customer 1 and 2 exists already. But in the first upload, the project price list was not been uploaded. So basically, we're going to modify those 2 customer records, and we are able for adding new records. Customer 3, 4, and 5 will be uploaded. For doing that, I'm going to use the data that I have downloaded. So the downloads from my project operations will tell me that which customers are existing already, and will give me the grid for that customer, and will give me the possibility for making sure that I do a modification for those customers and I create new ones. As you can see in the second table, you see that's the table that I'm going to upload. So I have the account ID for my customer 1. I have the account ID for my customer 2. And I did some queries so that I know what is the currency ID, what is my company ID, what is my customer group ID. So I did that all in my data migration environment by combining that information. What you also maybe have noticed is that I'm missing one record. So I only had 4 records for uploading. And this is basically an example where you see that data in my source environment is not correct and needs to be modified. Typically, you would expect that that will be done in the source environment, but sometimes that's not working or is not possible. And then our data migration environment should have a possibility for doing those modifications. As you can see, I've put that validation and I've the corrections all in my stored procedure for creating my upload table. And if I'm now running that pipeline, that first stored procedure will fix the data issues, will create that table which is ready for uploading. And after that, you see that we have been modifying the first 2 customers, and we have created 3 new customers in this pipeline. Second thing that I want to upload is projects and tasks. For projects and tasks, I'm not going to use the Azure Data Factory, but I'm going to use some code which has been written in Visual Studio. So it's basically an application. So that application is making a connection also to my project operations environment, will make a connection to my Azure Data SQL database, and then we'll just read from the SQL database and use the organizational service for creating the projects. So why are we using this API? So in this API, the first action that I'm going to use is the ismdin create project v1. And the reason for it is basically that if we are creating projects via the user interface, the moment we're opening Project for Web does need a default bucket. And if the default bucket is not on the project, the UI will basically first create the default bucket before it will it will be used by Project for Web. Now, if we're doing data migration and we have only be creating the project via the Dataverse import mechanism, we would have to open first all the projects before we could start uploading the task. So therefore, instead of just doing that, we're going to call this action, and this action will not only create a project, but will also have created the default project. Another action that I want to highlight is the copy project v3. So typically something that is not been used during your data migration, but can be used later on if you want to have templates, for instance, and you want to use this functionality, the copy project. You could define some projects, define them as a template project, and then you could use that copy functionality for copying the template company into a new project. What will happening is as soon as you start copying, the target project will get a status reason project copying. And as long as that status is project copying, you should not do any interaction. So you should not have custom logic trying to do already updates or modifications to projects or project tasks, because that would interfere with the copy functionality. And typically we will end up with projects which are not fully copied. So as long as that status is project copying, we should not run any other logic on that project. The moment that this function has finished, it will set the status of the target into active, and that's the moment that we can start using that functionality. The last action that I want to highlight here is the get project status. This is a new one, and basically is a function that can be used for finding out if the project for web is still synchronizing data for a specific project. So how does it work? We're going to create an an organization request of type get project save status, we're going to give it as a parameter the project ID that we're talking about, and then we're going to execute it. And basically, we will get a Boolean response telling us whether there is a save ongoing on that project or not. And that typically will help us making sure that if we have custom logic, that our custom logic is not interfering with the project scheduling service. All right, by now we should have our project created. So as you can see, we do have a project. That project will have its default bucket. But as you can see, the effort is still 0, so we don't have any tasks on our task breakdown structure. So now I'm going to use the operation set for adding tasks to that. So once we have created the tasks, basically how does it work? We're going to use a new entity, which is called operation set. We're going to create one operation set per project, and then we're going to request for tasks that need to be executed. For instance, we can ask for creating a task in the project. We can ask for modifying some data, existing data from an existing task in a project. We can add resource assignments. We can update project buckets. We can define dependencies, saying that one task should be dependent of another. So we're going to bundle those requests all into the same operation set. Each time we are adding something into the operation set, basically that call will verify that the parameters are okay. If parameters are okay, and we have all our requests in the operation set, our next step is that we're going to call the execute operation set. And basically, we're going to give the operation set to the project scheduling service. Once the project service has accepted that operation set, it will just return to the caller and tell, okay, I have accepted this request. But then in batch, it will start executing those requests one by one, and it will validate if there is not a conflict with, for instance, other things which are already in that project or other requests that are coming in for the same project. And if one of those requests would fail, basically that service will roll back the complete operation set and will mark the status of the operation set as not okay. If everything goes fine, we will be executing everything. We will be saving the changes to our dataverse, and our operation set will get a status okay. So showing you some pseudocode, and this is basically here a link to a docs article where this is described in more detail. But basically, the first step is we're asking we're creating a new organization set of type operation set. We're going to add the project ID and the descriptions to that. And if we execute it, we get a GUID. Then we're going to create for instance, PSS create tasks. We can, for instance, add a new project task to our operation set. So we're giving parameter 1 is an entity, parameter 2 is the operation set, and the execute basically will tell us if that is accepted as a request or not. This we will do multiple times, so we can create multiple tasks. We can create tasks and some team members. We can assign team members to a specific task. We can create dependencies. If we have done whatever is needed for that project in an operation set, then we're going to call that execute. At that moment, it is handed over to the project scheduling entity. The execute call is finished, but we will have to wait in our logic till that process scheduling service has finished and has updated the result of the dataset. So typically in our logic, we will see a kind of polling and verifying if our operation set has already received its status okay, or in worst case, not okay. And then we will have to find out what went wrong. This demo has been written as a console application with the organization service. We also created a GitHub example where we actually do all those operations via our data calls. And there we are showing that you also can use the data for getting similar results. By now, our task should already been created. So if we are refreshing our project, you will see that our effort is now changed into 32 hours. And if we're opening the project, you will see that we have a parent task that we have under that parent task, we have two tasks, task 1, task 2. We have assigned users to it, and we have made a dependency. So task 2 will be starting if task 1 has been finished. Some lessons that we've learned by now is first of all, avoid using synchronous plugins on those scheduling entities, because if the project scheduling service is writing asynchronous back, and then we're firing one of the plugins and that plugin fails, that error message will never been brought up to the user again, because this is an asynchronous process. So the full error messaging will be lost. Also, you need to be taken into consideration if you're calling schedule APIs from plugins, there is a 2-minute timeout. So we need to make sure that our operation sets are not too big, so that they would not be bigger than the 2 minutes. And don't forget that if you execute an operation set, even if the execute finish as complete, it means that the operation set has been accepted. You still need to monitor then afterwards for the status of the operation set. And it's only if the operation set has its status as okay that you can conclude that everything has been executed correctly. The writing from Project for Web to the Dataverse basically is running as a single user, Microsoft project, and that Microsoft project user is also throttled by the service protection limits. So although you can use the project schedule API in parallel, you need to make sure that you are not hitting those service protection limits. Error handling. So when something goes wrong, the error handling errors will be written back into the operation set, and we will be able either going into the UI, and there we have the PSS error log, which will actually tell us what operation set has failed, but also giving details of why the operation set was failing. Some remarks regarding load balancing. So each user can maximum has 10 open operation sets. So if you try to have more than 10, basically the system will not accept the next operation set. Of course, you would be each of those operation sets can have already 100 operations in it. But also there with the 100 operations, you need to be looking into that it's still acceptable for your custom business logic as well. So sometimes that 100 might be a little bit too high. And typically also, if you're trying to find out what is causing issues, typically if you have less number of the transactions in your operation set, it's easier to find out. You can use multiple users for during your migration, and then each of those users can have 10 operation sets in parallel, but still think about the service protection limits. So definitely, if you're talking, if you have projects where you want to have a lot of project tasks needs to be uploaded, that definitely will need some additional planning for making sure that it's done in the right chunks of data. Last upload that I'm going to do for master data is the project contracts. That's similar. The only thing that I want to highlight here is if we're creating a project order has a reference field customer ID, which is of type customer, and customer can either be an account or can be a contact. So we will need to have an additional field which is called customer ID at entity reference. And I'm going to put there whether I'm going to connect that record, is that record that I'm giving or that ID that I'm passing whether that is an account or whether that is an ID in the contact table. Okay, I know my contract and my order lines has been uploaded. If I do a refresh, you will see that we have a new project contract which has been uploaded, and we have a contract line. The only thing that is missing at that moment is a project. The project was not able to upload via DMF, and that's basically because we do have a validation. If we are adding a project to a project contract, basically the estimates will be updated, and there is a validation that that update can only be triggered by a built-in plugin. Now, if we're doing that via the UI, then that validation will know that the update on the estimate is coming from via that registered plugin, and it will work correctly. If I'm doing it from my Azure Data Factory, basically that validation doesn't see that we're also coming through that same plugin, and basically will throw the validation. So the mitigation for this issue was just using the organizational service, and basically I'm adding the project via my organization service program. All right, let's move to the last topic regarding opening balances and transactions. There, I want to start with telling you that there are basically two ways of doing uploading the open balances. So let's look first to the one where we just say the only thing we're going to upload is master data and open transactions. So open transactions means all the transactions that have not been posted already in your legacy system. So how would you do that? First of all, in Dataverse, we're going to create projects, we're going to create tasks, we're going to create our contracts, milestones for all the things that are still open. And then as for any other data migration, we would create opening balances in finance and operations for all other subledgers. So not project subledgers, for instance, accounts receivable, accounts payable, general ledger, depending on the data migration strategy. And typically those opening balances, you would be uploading them using a data migration clearing account. As last step, we're just going to upload it all non-posted transactions. So if we had already some time records which were submitted and approved, we're going to upload them first in status draft. And then either we're going to use the user interface for bringing them into the status approved, or we're going to use some logic that we can write for moving them into the next stage. Typically, this is possibly something that where we are using where in case that exporting data from legacy system is too complex, because yeah, of course, your data migration is a lot easier, but as the major disadvantage is, of course, that if you look, for instance, to the statement of a project, you will not get a correct answer because you will only see what has been reported after you go live. Everything that was reported before that information would not be into your project operations. So if you need such a report, you will have to use a customized report in which you're going to mix and match data from the new project operations as well of information that you still can extract from the legacy system. And also in your project operations, you cannot do revenue recognition. So this is really not an ideal situation. So in most cases, we assume that besides doing what you have been doing in the first scenario, is you're also going to add all transactions which were already posted in the legacy system for the open projects that were migrated. And how are we going to do that? Basically, all the steps are the same. The only thing that we're going to do for the posted transactions, basically, we're going to create a journal. And we're going to aggregate amounts for the time, expense, materials that were posted in already. And basically, when we post this journal, we either are going to use a data migration clearing account, or we can reverse that posting in our finance and operations. We just have to avoid that, of course, that information typically will be already in our will be in our opening balances that we have been uploaded. So we would have that already. The invoices would already be coming in our accounts receivable on that customer. So we don't want to have that amount double. So that's the reason why we either use a clearing account or we need to reverse those transactions. And then, of course, we would have a full project statement for all ongoing projects in our data verse environment. The cons, of course, is we need to write a little bit of logic for not having to do too much things manually. And basically, we're going to demonstrate that shortly after. So how does it work? I'm going to create now a Dataverse journal with aggregated amounts per project. I'm not saying that if we have a lot of projects that we should only create one journal, but typically we would have a journal with a number of lines. Each of journals should at least have a line with a transaction type cost for the fixed fee projects as well as for time and material, and would have a line with transaction type unbilled sales for the time and material projects. The journal type is of type entry, and we're going to say whether what transaction class that we need, whether it's time, expense, or material. We could have some more details. For instance, if you want for time, you would also want to see how much has been posted by role. You could have a line for each role. Then once that journal has been uploaded, we're going to confirm it. That will generate some project actuals. We will mark those unbilled sales actuals as ready to invoice. We will generate and confirm the invoice. So for uploading the journal, I'm going to use a data migration framework, just creating first the journal. Once we have created the journal, making sure that I have all the newly created projects. So I'm doing a download again of all the project IDs. So then I can have in my journal lines references to all projects. Once we have uploaded that, we will see a new journal into our Dataverse. It will have, in my example, two lines, one cost line, one unbilled sales, and that's all the costs and unbilled sales, which was done already, was posted already in our legacy system. Now I'm going to make sure that we automatically can post that journal. And then once the journal is posted, we will see that in the billing time and material billing backlog, we have that record from the unbilled sales. If I mark it ready as invoice, we will see in the Dataverse that this record automatically gets the status ready to invoice. Now we can create the invoices. This makes that we have a new invoice for this new project contract, and I can post that invoice. So we now have actually everything ready in our Dataverse. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Veselina, who will explain how it looks now on the finance and operations side.
Thanks, Marc. So I'm going to show you what happens on the finance side. As part of any data migration, you can follow different approaches and step sequence to bring in the finance and the subledger balances in the system. Whichever approach you choose, the key objective is that the data are complete, accurate, and you can start to transact with them. So it is vital that the data validation and reconciliation is run multiple times. So in our short demo, we'll assume that all the other subledgers and the general ledger are already migrated and validated. And our task is to update the project subledger with the correct balances without creating any other ledger movements. As a result, you'll see that no change in the trial balance or related to our scenario customer subledger will occur, but only the project statement updated with the correct cost and revenue amounts. So let's start. So first, we're going to check our project and to see that there is no posted transactions at the moment. And if we look at the project statement and we try to update the balances, we'll find out that it's only updated with the budget amounts that was brought in by Marc when he created the tasks with the estimates for them. So you'll see that we have balances in our project for revenue and for the cost hours. Marc, could you please continue with the demo? Thank you. So we're checking the statement and we see no actuals at the moment are done. So the next step is let's check our trial balance. So for the period that we're migrating the data, we'll see that all our balances are already populated, but we have no movements on our accounts. And the customer we're using, it has a balance of 296. And then the next thing we'd like to do is to bring the data from the Deygere side. For that reason, we're going to use import from staging table. Again, it's a step that you can automate, but for the demo purposes, I'm going to click on each one of them to see what will happen. So we're checking our integration journal, and we'll see that one was created with 2 lines in it. So one is for the cost and another one is for our unbilled cell, which when we post this journal now, we'll create the actual for cost, and we're going to create the WIP revenue against accrual of that revenue. In our case, we're not changing the posting profiles for data migration, but using them as they are. However, you can have a different approach and use specifically a design for data migration posting profiles. So the journal now is posted, and the next thing I'd like to check is our invoice proposal. So the moment we trigger this integration, we'll see that project invoice proposal was created. So let's go to our project module, project invoice proposal, and we'll see that we have a header. However, there is no amount in it. So you have to run again the import from staging, i.e. to trigger yet another set of integration that will bring in now the posted invoice based on the actuals that are already in the system. So let's check that again. So you'll see now that the 700 of our invoice that Marc posted on the Deygere site, it's already in. And if we can open it, we can check the amounts, see if everything is correct, and then we post. So if anything needs to be corrected, we need to apply the same approach as with everything else, i.e. we need to correct our source data. In this case, the source data are in Deygere. So now let's check what happened with our trial balance. We calculate the figures for our data migration period, and we'll see that we have posted AR amount, we have our sales and WIP revenue that were reversed as part of the 2 postings, and we have a cost for our labor taken from the payroll. If we refresh our customer balance, we'll see that that's updated with this additional 700, and it's now 3660. And if we refresh the project statement, you will find out that we have now actuals for the revenue and the cost of hours put in the system. So the next step is to reverse these transactions to ensure that our financials and the error ledger are as they were before we started this. So we're creating data migration journal, and we're going to use for our purposes load ledger transaction function. We're choosing the period we invert the site, and we're ensuring that every voucher is one-to-one linked to the ones that we're reversing. There we go. The only thing we need to change here is our customer subledger pointing to the correct customer for the transaction that needs to be reversed. And then we validate the journal and we post. In this option, we reverse one-to-one every transaction. However, usually you may want to summarize by period and just offset by the data migration clearing account. And again, reconcile and reconcile again. So let's check what happened with our trial balance. If we calculate the balances again, we'll see that the amounts were back to what they were and we have no movements. Let's check our customer balance, went back to where it were, and our project statement is updated with the correct figures. And by doing that, we brought in the project subledger, but we did no changes to the financial or any other subledgers that were already brought in the system, tested, validated. And on that note, I'm going to hand over back to Marc to continue with the other scenarios that we have as part of the data migration.
So what is left over? The last step that we need to do is everything what was not posted in a legacy system, but still was recorded already. So some people might have already entered some time. There might be some expenses. Typically, all those entries we're going to upload in status draft. If we had the material that typically would be coming in as via a purchase order, so we would be uploading that material on that purchase order in our finance and operation. And then either you use the UI logic for bringing it into the right state, but also that typically is something that you want to automate so that you don't have manual activities that needs to do. And then you would first bring it from draft to submitted, from submitted to approve, and even once it is approved, you might find the actuals and mark those as ready to invoice. And the last step is we need to think about milestones. So if we have open milestones, we're going to upload those as well. For doing that, just bringing in the time, for instance. The time is brought in via the time entry. The first thing is we're going to upload it via our Azure Data Factory as draft. And then I'm going to call some actions. For instance, if you want to have them submitted, you can call time entry submit. If they are approved, then afterwards you would still do a call to time entries approve. And if you want to make them ready to invoice, you're just going to take the actuals in the billing backlog, and you can call the Marc actual ready to invoice or not. Important to say is there is of course a link between the time entry and the actual, and you could basically via what is registered find which record is linked to which time entry. But also if you just bring in first all the ones that needs to be ready to invoice, as one batch, then you know that whatever you find in your billing backlog can be marked ready to invoice. And then in a second phase, you would be uploading the ones which are approved. So if you upload them in stages, then typically you don't need to follow that link between the entries, but you can just assume that everything that was uploaded is ready for doing its action. Also, I want to highlight that this actions are marked as Microsoft internal, so you can use them for your data migration, but don't use them if you depend on them forever. They are not publicly available. Expense, similar scenario. The expense entity, we have expense entry submit, expense entries approve, and mark actual ready to invoice, which is the same on your actual entity. Of course, there is a remark here. You could also use the expense module in finance and operations. And of course, you would not upload your expenses then in Dataverse, but you would upload them in via finance and operations, and then have to bring them to the workflow in the finance and operation. Material, similar entity is called material usage log, has the same actions, material usage log submit, material usage log approval, and mark actual ready to invoice on your actual. So it's the same logic you're going to do for materials. Last thing that I want to highlight is about what do you do with milestones. So there's a different approach. If you have fully invoiced the billing milestones, we do have a docs article, which is linked here on slide, so which describes the process in detail. But just to summarize what's happening is we're going to modify the dual right map for the integration contract line milestones entity. And basically, we're going to create a map that if we upload them in Dataverse with a status ready for invoicing, we're going to dual write them to finance and operations as fully invoiced. So at that moment, once we have created that special map, we're going to import the milestones with a status of ready for invoicing. And of course, we can only import now the milestones that have been fully invoiced. At that moment, we will see in finance and operations that they will appear as fully invoiced on our on-account transactions. Then we're going to stop the dual write maps for contract line milestones, for integration actuals, and for invoice proposals. And basically, we're going to create and confirm pro forma invoices in Dataverse. Since we don't have dual write maps, nothing will be synchronized to finance and operations, so our finance and operations is not touched. And once that step is done, we're going to revert all the billing miles, all the dual write maps, and to restart them. And then, of course, we still need to upload the open billing milestones, the one which were not invoiced. But those we want to have them going through finance and operations as well, because we need to do the full actions later on those milestones. So what are the key takeaways from this? I'm hoping at least that you got this from our tech talk. So data migration efforts should not be underestimated, and we should not postpone it to later stages in the project. It's really key essential that it starts from day one, and data migration is a joint responsibility. Typically, the only person being able for extracting data from the legacy system is your customer. But on the other hand, knowing how to upload it into the new system, this is a responsibility or a knowledge that you as a partner has, and that you need to be bringing that to those two worlds together is a joint activity. Once you have uploaded your data into the new system, the validation of the data, of course, is again something that the business users from the customer needs to be done. This necessarily that you are familiar with the tools that you will be using. And since this is a solution based on different platforms, you do have different tools that you will have to use. I think it's important that during data migration that you define the sets that you're going to upload them in the different stages, such as I said, you first upload all the steps, all the the steps that are ready to invoice, and then the next step you're going to upload the other records. So you need to identify those batches and make sure that you execute them in the right order. And you need to know that it is a repetitive activity. So it needs to be showing off in your project plan that you have multiple iterations of your data migration. It needs to be rehearsed, the data migration. The data that is uploaded needs to be tested and validated. And typically you expect that the first run will have some major issues. So you will have to rerun that before a couple of times before you will get a data set that is acceptable. And it is key essential that your data migration is done correctly, because if you go live on data which is not correct and you start doing already transactions and then you need to correct the data which has those transactions already, you can end up in really nightmare scenarios. Also, since it is an iterative process, try to avoid doing too much manual interactions. As I mentioned, if you cannot modify the data in your source system, make sure that you automate the step for doing the corrections, so that after the first time you have identified an issue, if you do the next iteration, you don't have to do the same steps over and over. With that, I'm going to end here and hand over back to Cora.
Thank you. I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We'd like your feedback on today's session and to hear what you'd like to see in future events. Thank you for your participation. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the TechTalk's Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and audience for joining us today.